Before we get started, I would appreciate if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. So today in this video I'm going to be talking about what is going to be happening in November in the Eurozone when ISO 20022 goes live. So I've been requested to make this video, and there's lots of people in the XRP community saying different things about what's going to happen in November, and one of the strongest narratives is that in November, when ISO 20022 goes live, HVPS is going to go live and RTGS is going to go live in the Eurozone for cross-border payments, and that means that they're going to have to utilize DOT-based systems such as XRP to facilitate cross-border transactions of high-value payments cross borders for instantaneous settlement. So that's the narrative that's being set out there. So this video is going to be a three-part video, and I plan to go through and break it all down and cover the whole thing. So part one is going to be about background and foundational information to give you guys the understanding so that you can understand when I make part two of this video. So part one is very important before you watch part two, so that you have the background and foundational understanding. Then part two will be breaking down what I believe is going to happen in November based upon my research with the Eurozone RTGS and ISO 20022 going live. And in part three, when I get around to making it, it will be about giving my own opinion, my own personal opinion. I'm not infallible, so it's just my opinion as to when I think XRP will be utilized. So let's get started. I would like to give a pre-warning that this video is not FUD. I'm not spreading fear, uncertainty or doubt, but is solely based upon my research and how I understand things. I could be right or wrong, but all my reasonings are clearly laid out as to why I have come to my conclusions. If you have confirmation bias, then I have to warn you, this video series may trigger you. That's a you problem, not me, because you have confirmation bias. However, feel free to refute or rebuttal me with evidence. That's the criteria. If you do so with evidence, I would listen to what you have to say instead of ad hominem attacking me or using straw man arguments against me. So if you do the latter, then I'm not going to take you seriously. I'm just going to see you as someone that does not have the intelligence to articulate yourself in a manner that is worth listening to. So instead of doing that, you can't provide any solid information and evidence, so you go for the most convenient way, and that is attacking me personally or using strawman arguments against me. And those tactics are what people usually resort to when they have confirmation bias and they are exposed to content that may be against what they want to believe. So that's just that. Also, I would just like to make it clear that just because I may not have hopium at the level you have, I am still extremely confident and bullish in the X assets, and by that I mean XRP, XDC, XLM in the grand scheme of things. And if you've watched any of my content, you would see that I am bullish on those assets, and you would see that I tell you that you need to be a long-term investor in this space. Just watch my previous videos and you would see that you have to be a long-term investor, you have to be patient, and you have to have thick skin and be able to overcome all the FUD, because I believe most retail investors would not make it with these assets because they don't have the patience. So let's get started, shall we? Part one, the foundation. So what is ISO 20022? It is an international standard for exchanging payment messages between financial institutions. The goal is for all financial institutions worldwide to eventually migrate over to this international global messaging standard called ISO 20022, known as MX. So it's the MX standard, MX messaging standard. And they are to migrate over to the MX messaging standard from their current messaging standard, which is MT. So currently banks today are using the MT messaging standard, and the goal is to eventually migrate over to ISO 20022, which is the MX messaging standard. So ISO 20022, what does it do? It creates a common language between financial institutions, which enables faster payment processing, more harmonization, and better interoperability between different payment systems These are some of the benefits of the ISO 20022 messaging standard. Now in and of itself, the standard is based on defining payment messages and is not related to cryptocurrencies. So on a side note here, so technically speaking, there is no such thing as an ISO 20022 compliant crypto. Terminology wise, that's technically incorrect because ISO 20022 has nothing to do with crypto at all. But however, there are DLT based financial systems that do use ISO 20022 compliant messaging standards to communicate, and those DLT based financial systems can also use crypto for settlement. So I hope that makes sense. Now, I myself, I understand that, but in order to shorten it, sometimes I just say ISO 20022 cryptocurrencies when I refer to the X assets. And that's just a short way for me to say basically the DLT based RTGS systems such as Ripple, IBM WorldWire, Impel, those RTGS financial systems are going to be compliant with the ISO 20022 messaging standard, and they also have the ability to leverage neutral bridge assets for instantaneous settlement. So rather than explain all that the long way, I just say, in ISO 20022 cryptocurrencies. But technically speaking, that's wrong. So I just want to make it clear. Some of the benefits of ISO 20022: compatible messaging between financial institutions worldwide. They want that global worldwide compatibility between all the financial institutions that send payment messages to each other. They want greater interoperability between different payment systems. They want more harmonization and less friction between different payment systems. They want to enable a more efficient payment processing time. They want to enhance payment speeds and reduce cost worldwide. And they want to enable higher quality messaging data to be sent that is more flexible and can adapt more easily to changes and new innovation or technologies. So these are some of the benefits that ISO 20022 will give financial institutions when they move over and migrate to it from the current messaging standard. So what are some of the ISO 20022 migration dates? Now the plan is by 2025, all banks and their different payment systems to be using the new global messaging standard. Until then, many banks are transitioning over in stages from now until 2025. They are transitioning over from the legacy messaging standard to ISO 20022. Now, Swift's migration date is this November in 2022. The Eurozone migration date is this November in 2022. And the UK's migration date is in 2023. And I think the USA migration date is in 2025. If you don't know already, over 70 countries have already adopted the ISO 20022 messaging in their payment systems, and these include Switzerland, China, they've adopted it in 2013, India and Japan, who adopted it in 2015. So as you can see, there are already some countries that are already ahead of the curve and they've adopted this new messaging standard, and countries like the Eurozone, UK, USA are behind in this regard, especially when you have China already adopting ISO 20022 in 2013. So what is Swift? Now, Swift is a messaging network responsible for sending the payment messages for international payments between banks worldwide. So they focus on sending the payment messages. The payment messages contain information that includes the payment instructions between financial institutions in the transaction. So the message would have information based upon instructions between the institutions. Basically, maybe to credit this account, debit that account, and by what amount. And there's obviously, that's a simplified explanation. It's more in depth and detailed than that, but it's just a messaging instruction. So Swift is not responsible for holding funds, handling money, or managing financial accounts on behalf of institutions. It does not deal with the clearing or settlements of payments between financial institutions. It's solely responsible for sending the MT messaging or the MX messages, which is going to be MX when we move over to ISO 20022. So once Swift transfers the payment messages internationally to its destination, then settlement occurs via the bank's payment systems. So Swift just deals with the moving of the messages, whereas the banks and their payment systems, they deal with the actual settlement. So what are RTGS, HVPS, LVPS payment systems? Real-time gross settlement, RTGS, is a payment transfer system mostly managed and run by a country's central bank. RTGS systems facilitate the instantaneous settlement. In other words, there's no waiting and irreversible transfer of funds between banks on an individual order base. So that means as and when they receive an order from the sending bank, the real-time gross settlement system then handles that order on an per individual basis, and it instantaneously settles that order, that transaction. So RTGS payment transfer systems are used mostly for instantly settling wholesale payments between banks. Wholesale payments basically means high value or large value payments. So RTGS systems are also known as high value payment systems, HVPS, and they can also be known as large value payment systems, LVPS. So if you were to read the documentations, you would see HVPS, LVPS, and they all basically mean the same thing, which is RTGS, real-time gross settlement, which is a system that does real-time payments for high-value payments. And they then refer to it as high-value payment systems or large-value payment systems, all the same thing. So bearing that in mind, does HVPS RTGS by default mean XRP? Now the short answer to this is no, it does not. Because I've heard some people in the XRP community say, or they have the opinion that RTGS equals HVPS, which equals XRP. Well, that's not necessarily true, because when you see the words RTGS/HVPS mentioned in documents, it does not automatically mean or imply XRP or Ripple at all. This is nothing but misunderstanding or misinformation, and this sort of misinformation can lead to forming wrong conclusions when connecting dots. So you need to be aware that HVPS and RTGS does not mean XRP. So are there any HVPS systems currently in operation today? Yes, there are. Of course there are. Now, many countries around the world already have their own active, live, operating RTGS, HVPS for years now. It's not something new. So why are people in the XRP community thinking and saying stuff like RTGS, HVPS is going live in the Eurozone this November when they have had RTGS, HVPS in operation in the Eurozone since 1999. This is why doing research is important, guys. Basic research, and you'll find this information. So I'm going to break down what is happening in November in the Eurozone in part 2 of this video. But before I even take it there, it's important that people understand the foundational basics first. And this is what part 1 is about, is explaining the basics. I need you to understand that RTGS, HVPS does not equals XRP, and you have to understand that RTGS, HVPS systems are already live in operation, and they have been for years now. So when people think this November in the Eurozone, RTGS, HVPS systems are going live, that's not true, because they are already live. But let's continue. So here's a document by the World Bank. It's a document that they did in 2010, and it's called Payment Systems Worldwide, a Snapshot. So the illustration that I'm going to show you next has all come from this document, the World Bank survey document from 2010 titled Payment Systems Worldwide, a Snapshot. So this illustration is from that document, the World Bank document, and here you can see the document was made in 2010, and here it says the main systems used for large value payments. And this is a world map, and as you can see, the red mark stands for RTGS. Now, most countries around the world, look at Europe, here's Europe on the map. Okay, most countries around the world are already using RTGS for large value payments. And if you look at the United States and Russia, they are green, and that also means RTGS plus something else. And then you have like the other type of green where it's here RTGS and check clearing house, which is these countries here, like Pakistan, they're using RTGS as well. And then you have yellow, which is other, which I don't see much countries in yellow. And then you have like this orange, which is check clearinghouse. But as you can see, most countries are in red, and most countries around the world have an RTGS system. And this is in 2010. They have an RTGS system, which means they have a HVPS system, which means they have a LVPS system. They have a system to process large value, high value payments, and that system is RTGS, real-time gross settlement. So to say it's going live in November is wrong, because you can see from this World Bank document in 2010 that most of the world already has RTGS already. Anyways, so here you can see the main system used for large value funds transfer, again from that World Bank document. It says here the world total 139 countries they must have done this study on, and it says 116 of them are using RTGS, and that's 83%. And a small percentage is using checking clearinghouse, and 18% is using other. So majority of them are using RTGS. And again, the RTGS systems worldwide, the number of countries 116, the number of countries where the central bank is the operator of the RTGS system 112 countries, number of countries where the central bank is the settlement agent for the RTGS 115 countries, number of systems that also process transactions in foreign currencies 10 systems, and there's countries with more than one RTGS system such as Brazil, China, Ecuador, Hong Kong, and this is all 2010. So RTGS is a worldwide payment mechanism. So let's get into the categories and types of RTGS systems. So from my research, it seems you can categorize RTGS systems into two categories. The first is non-DOT based RTGS systems. So these are basically RTGS systems that are not leveraging DOT based technology to facilitate instant settlement of fund transfers. And they can also be separated into two types. So you have HVPS, wholesale payments, high value payments, and you have LVPs, low value payments, which is retail systems. So the non-DOT based RTGS systems, you can break it down into two types: those that process high value payments, and those that also RTGS systems that focus on low value payments. And then you have the other category, which is DOT based RTGS systems, and these are RTGS systems that are leveraging DOT technology to facilitate instant settlement of fund transfers, like Ripple, for example, which can leverage XRP. So it's good to know this, that there are two types of RTGS systems out there. And here's the diagram, just outlining what I've said. So you have the RTGS systems, and you have two types, the DOT based and the non-DOT based. And non-DOT based can be also broken down into two types: those that process and deal with high value payment systems, high value payments such as CHAPS in the UK, Target2 in Euro, and Fedwire in the USA. They mostly are RTGS systems that deal with high value payments. And then you have RTGS systems that are mostly catered for low value payments, which is FPS in the UK, the faster payment service. And then you have TIPS in Euro, and you have FedNow in the USA. I did a video on FedNow, if you haven't watched it, where I was basically dealing with the opinion where most people believe that when FedNow goes live in 2023 for instant domestic payments, that they're going to be utilizing XRP. I had to cover that in that video. Yeah, it's a good video, watch it. And then you have the DOT based RTGS systems. Now Ripple, IBM Worldwire, and Impel, which utilizes all of them, the X assets. Now these systems can be used to process high value payments and low value payments put together. So how do RTGS, HVPS currently process cross-border payments? So RTGS/HVPS are already live around the world. I've shown you that already. So how are they currently processing cross-border payments today? They do it by using a non-DOT based method called correspondent banking. And that's how they process cross-border payments today via correspondent banking. So what is correspondent banking? Correspondent banking is the way banks process cross-border payments with their RTGS payment systems today. Correspondent banks are the intermediaries or the middlemen between two banks that do not have a direct account with each other. So correspondent banks are used to forward the payment messages for the sending bank to the recipient when the two banks, in other words, the sender and receiver, do not have a direct relationship with each other. So I'm going to show you some diagrams to illustrate what I've just said to make it easier for you to visualize. So cross-border payments with direct links between banks. So Bank A has a direct relationship with Bank B. They are both have accounts with each other. So Bank A can send a direct payment message, MT message, using SWIFT to Bank B. The payment message would instruct the bank to debit and credit accounts accordingly for the payment to be settled. And this is a simplified cross-border payment when two banks have direct relationships with each other. So here we have the cross-border payment via correspondent banks. And a correspondent bank is the bank in the middle. So if Bank A and Bank B do not have accounts with each other, they have to use a bank where they both have accounts with. And this is known as the correspondent bank or the middleman. So Bank A does not have an account with Bank B. So the correspondent bank, let's call the correspondent bank Bank X, has an account with both Bank A and Bank B. So Bank A will send a MT payment message to Bank X. And then Bank X would also send a MT payment message to Bank B. Now, correspondent banking is an essential step in the global payment system for cross-border transactions. And that's how cross-border transactions are processed today. It's facilitated via correspondent banking. And here we have correspondent banking with more correspondent banks in the middle because the chain is larger, the chain is longer. So, and this usually happens when the currency pair is a currency pair that is not really common. So it requires more correspondent banks needed to make the payment in order for the payment to be settled at its destination. And this obviously, the larger the chain, the more cost and the more delays at each stage. And as you can see, each stage requires a message to be sent to the next bank. And this is the MT message. This is pre-ISO 20022. This is what we're using today, the messaging standard MT. And they want to move over to ISO 20022, the MX standard, for a more harmonized and frictionless approach toward correspondent banking. So some challenges with cross-border payments today. The more correspondent banks in the chain, the slower and more expensive the transactions will be. At each bank in the chain, fees will be taken for processing the payment message. Each bank in the chain will need to update their balances in their accounts accordingly. The sending bank will need to hold enough liquidity to cover these unknown costs until the payment is complete. So the liquidity, the capital, is tied up in nostro-vostro accounts for all banks in the chain, which have to be pre-funded in advance in multiple currencies for settlement. So there is so much friction with cross-border payments using correspondent banking due to long transaction chains, due to checks in between, due to processing and translating of the MT messages between different banks, and the potential for data corruption on the journey to a cure. So these are some of the challenges with cross-border payments that we have today. And the idea is that when we transition over to ISO 20022, it would mitigate some of these challenges. So let's look at cross-border payments using an RTGS HVPS via correspondent banks. Because remember, I've told you HVPS RTGS is already live. So how are these banks doing cross-border payments if they are already live and they're clearly not using XRP to do it? So this is an illustration to give you an example of how they're doing it. So there we have in the middle the central bank, and the central bank has the real-time gross settlement system, or the HVPS system, whatever you want to call it. And let's call this central bank the Central Bank of Europe, which everyone believes that they're waiting for November to go live with HVPS when they're already doing this today. So this is the Central Bank of Europe. And then we have Bank B, Bank C, Bank A, Bank D, and these banks are direct participants. All these banks have an account, a direct account with the central bank. So imagine Bank B wants to send payment to Bank C. They both have an account at the central bank, and once the message is sent across, then the real-time gross settlement system can literally just debit, credit the accounts of each bank, and it's done more or less instantaneously in real time. So that's how it's done. And here's an example. Bank A wants to send 27 million to Bank C. So Bank A wants to send 27 million to Bank C. During an RTGS transfer, accounts of the different banks with the central bank are respectively debited and credited. And that's all done once the payment message is sent. So SWIFT could send the payment message from Bank A to Bank C, and then the RTGS system does the debiting and crediting based upon the message, and that's it. All done in real time, and that transaction is settled. Now, these are for banks that are directly connected to the central bank. What about banks that are cross-border, that are not directly connected to the central bank? So what about a bank that's not in Europe and they want to use the real-time gross settlement system of the Central Bank of Europe in order to make a payment? So here, Bank X. Now, Bank X, just say Bank X is in USA, for example. Bank X wants to send a payment to Bank C. However, it cannot do it directly using the central bank RTGS system, as it does not have an account with the central bank. However, Bank X has an account with Bank B, which can use the RTGS system to pay Bank C on behalf of Bank X. So Bank B in this example is the correspondent bank needed for Bank X to basically pay Bank C using the RTGS system. So Bank B would act as a correspondent bank. And that's how it's done. So Bank X would send a message to Bank B, and in this message it would instruct Bank B that obviously it wants to pay Bank C with the accounts that it has with Bank B. And then Bank B, on behalf of Bank X, would facilitate that transaction and pay Bank C. And the messaging would all be sent across, and accordingly accounts would be debited, credited. And that's how they will be settled. So Bank X can indirectly benefit from the RTGS system via using Bank B as a correspondent bank. And that's how cross-border payments are done today using RTGS, HVPS. It's all done via correspondent banks. Now, in this example, I obviously gave an example of one bank, but then you can also have a situation where there's another bank connected to Bank X that doesn't have an account with Bank B. And so it could be a longer chain, for example. So imagine you had Bank Z connected to Bank X and it wants to send a payment to Bank C. Then again, it would use Bank X would use Bank B because it has an account with Bank B, and then the payment would be sent to Bank C. And this is all known as correspondent banking. I hope that makes more sense. So where does the liquidity today come from for the RTGS HVPS payments to occur? So liquidity is usually from the banks that are all connected to the central bank RTGS system, known as direct participants. So in this example, we have Bank A, B, C, D. They'll be direct participants, and liquidity would usually come from the direct participants. Now, obviously, this system usually has more than 4 banks as a direct participant, but this is just a simplified illustration to help you understand the process. So they have liquidity management tools where all direct participants can manage, monitor, transfer liquidity in central bank money between each other, and so on. So the direct participants are the main providers of liquidity in this RTGS system, because liquidity is needed for sure. So again, this is a table from the World Bank document that was made in 2010, and it talks about the sources of liquidity in RTGS systems, and it gives different sources of liquidity. So it says majority of the liquidity worldwide, in a worldwide total of 94 banks that they must have looked at, 93% the liquidity came from opening balances and funds received from other participants during the day. So in other words, other participants of the direct RTGS system, as I just said, their opening balances and funds that they've received from these participants was where liquidity was mostly sourced from. And then you can have participants can use part of their reserve requirements, some liquidity came from that. Participants can use all their reserve balance, lines of credit between banks. So they also have the ability to get credit between banks that are all connected to the RTGS system. The RTGS operator allows collateralized current account overdrafts. The RTGS operator grants collateralized credit either in the form of loan or repo. The RTGS operator allows uncollateralized credit. So as you can see, these are different sources of liquidity in the RTGS system, and this is all stated in 2010. So does the current system today need to use XRP to process cross-border high-value payments with RTGS? The short answer is no, they don't, because they are already doing it and they are not using XRP. The proof is that they are and always have been doing HVPS, high-value payments, with RTGS cross-border, and they have not been using XRP to do it. They are doing it using correspondent banking, and they have not used a DLT-based RTGS settlement system to do it like Ripple, which leverages XRP. And this is important to understand for those who think RTGS HVPS has yet to go live for cross-border payments in the Eurozone in November. You have to understand this because this is misinformation. Why do you think something is going to go live in November that they are already doing, that they already have? It's actually a bit funny, but yeah, it is already live. That's why I said it's funny. It's actually funny that people think something is going live that is already live, and they have not used XRP to do it. So this system is already live and they are not using XRP. So a lot of people are saying they're going to have to use XRP because high value payment systems need XRP and the RTGS system needs XRP in order to facilitate cross. No, it doesn't. Don't get me wrong. There are benefits to having XRP, but they don't need to use XRP at the moment if they don't want to, because they already have the infrastructure, the systems in place, correspondent banks all there, and they are already doing cross-border payments without XRP. And HVPS is already live, RTGS is already live. So how can it be going live again in November? So what is happening in November then? What do I think is going to happen in November? Stay tuned for part 2. And I have to break it up into parts, otherwise this would just be too long a video. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell notification icon so as to not miss my next video.